ELI5 Why did the economy change that we need 2 full-time breadwinners as opposed to 1 less than a decade ago? Because most women started working, and people's spending habits adjusted. Average in 1950 meant that the man went to work at a factory while his wife stayed home and took care of the kids. Women working was very unusual, so on average, people lived in much smaller houses and had a lot less stuff. Average today means that the man and the woman go to work. Women working is the standard, and so on average, families have 2 incomes, much bigger houses, and a lot more stuff. On average, families today earn a lot more money overall, and they spend a lot more too. When I was 16 2008 I worked at McDonald's. Pay was $7.25 and McDoubles cost $1.08 with tax included. 15 years later starting McDonald's pay is $9.00 if they are short-handed and McDoubles cost $2.32 with tax included. This problem is across the board and only growing rapidly. We are so fucked. Something is going to break. I don't now know what part of the machine will break, but we are redlining this bad boy and it's terrifying that no one wants to or can stop the runaway engine because a handful of people will profit big time from the broken down engine. 1. Fundamental shift in the economy from goods-based to service-based. 2. Increase in transportation and decrease in costs means that the world is now smaller, so there is more access to labor and other cheap resources. 3. Change in spending habits prioritized high-value assets. Example, homes have more than doubled in square feet in that same time frame. 4. Increase in quality of goods and services both as explicit and implicit costs. 5. Increase in population and demand for scarce resources such as prime urban plots in cities. 10 years ago 57.4% of women worked. Today 57.4% of women work. In 1989 57.4% of women worked. In 1965 40% of women worked. Source. That's definitely a shift from 40 working to 57 working, but it's not really all that different for most people. My mom was a painter in the 80s. My grandma worked at a car parts factory in the 60s. My great-grandmother worked at a publishing company. I didn't have any friends in the 80s whose moms didn't work. I think you may have a slightly skewed perception of the timeline. 2-income households have been the norm requirement since way further back than 2013. Regardless, there are a lot of factors. One of them being that people started to figure out that if the woman also worked, they could afford more toys, bigger houses, nicer cars, etc. This drove the price of these things up due to higher demand. This in turn forced many others who didn't necessarily want to work into the labor market. Jobs being shipped overseas cannot be underestimated. Today US is a service economy, that is code word for expendable. There's just not much demand for US labor, and so its price is much less competitively. However, it is important to make sure people are still employed in large part to avoid social contagion. So you have people hired to jobs which don't really need them, and pay them uncompetitively. No competition and demand for workers, no fair wages for work. It's been much longer than that for a single middle-class income. And the answer is twofold: inflation and companies being allowed to get away with ridiculous pricing schemes. Take video games for example. PlayStation 1 was like $300 brand new with $20 $50 games. Nowadays PS5 can run $700 and each new AAA title is $70. And they're all microtransactioned up to hell. Both things happen due to inflation and the consumer allowing it to happen. Economy makes more money with 2 people working and spending all their money. It's more about labor than money. More people equals more labor needed. In order for things to keep the rate of growth they've experienced, they need more workers. Basically, the underlying factor is greed, population growth, and consumerism. With all of them combined there's a perfect storm for inflation, shrinkflation, and more people needing to work longer hours. We've been cutting taxes on corporations for 70 years. They just pocket the money they previously paid out in compensation to their workforce lest they be taxed at reasonable rates. Great for the balance sheet and shareholders, terrible for the aggregate economy, the foundation of which is consumer spending. Productivity and inflation continue to rise while wages stagnate. Outsourcing, automation, anti-labor laws, etc. The end. Honestly, people just have higher expectations. You could easily live comfortably on 1 income if you lived like people did a century ago. Most people didn't even have indoor plumbing or phone lines back then, let alone mobile data plans and streaming video plans. And they had 5 or 6 sets of clothes that they patched up when they wore out. Basically just become Amish. They had no problems at all living on one income. We used to make approximately 60 of the value of our labor, and the management owners investors would split the 40. Now we earn approximately 11 of the value of our labor according to recent statistics. The top one keeps 89 of our value instead of 40, it is literally that simple. Corporations posting higher and higher profits every quarter. Those profits are coming out of our pockets. TLDR greedflation. In the mid-20th century, women were not expected to work, and most did not. The workforce was half the size because it was almost entirely men. This made it harder for companies to fill all the jobs they needed to operate correctly, and they needed to be competitive with their wages to attract new employees and keep the ones they had from leaving. This is only one of many contributing factors. Unions. No one has included unions in their answer anywhere yet, though many people hit on a lot of topics. Erosion of unionization, conservative rollbacks of labor rights contributing to that in a big way, and workers failing to remain in solidarity through division like racism and sexism also contributing. There are a few factors, but it's all because of capitalism. Part of it is that a teenager today has phones, computers, clothing and other stuff that in equivalent dollars probably exceed what a family of 4 from 1950 would own. Parents also have that stuff. Life is more expensive for entirely optional things that we somehow can't live without. We can live much more cheaply today than we choose to, aggregately. Timeline a bit off. Let's start post-World War II. The rest of the industrialized world was in ruins and rebuilding. The US was the major producer of goods, wages high enough for single income to support a household. Slowly move a few decades other nations develop, and enter economics. This was a nail on the coffin for the middle class. Because a few decades ago top earners paid significantly higher taxes than today, and income inequality was lower. Almost none of the productivity gains in the economy were captured by the low and mid-income earners, while the costs of university education, healthcare and housing went up, to fuel corporate shareholders' wealth accumulation. It started in the 70s when US industrialists started moving manufacturing overseas. Nixon opened the door with China and that is all she wrote. Capital had access to cheap labor and little to no regulations. We became a service economy. Fun fact, the CIA funded Ms. Magazine. The government co-opted feminism for its own means. This goes back to the turn of the century for Black Americans. The post-war 1950s image of nuclear family with a dad working and the mom raising 2.3 kids in the suburbs was the exception, not the norm. Look at Boston Irish Catholic slums where the women were working and child malnutrition was common even on 2 incomes. Plain and simply, because people are greedy. They want for themselves, and the more they get, the more they want. And they typically don't care about putting other people's lives in jeopardy, as long as taking from others doesn't affect them. But when it does affect them, they suddenly change their tune. It's just how capitalism works, which is disgusting. Over time, the costs for everything go up and up. And in the end, the 99.99% of people globally would be so poor they would even be willing to kill for the right of oxygen, and the 0.01% would be so wealthy and powerful they'd play gods in this world. BF and I just got a rental. $500 a week for just the rent. We both make $750, $800 a week. Couldn't afford a place on our own. Versus my parents, I make more than my mother and my dad does not work, he is retired. They own a house worth $1.52 million. It was $500,000 18 years ago. It's absolutely crazy. The abandon of the gold standard, replace it with fiat money. That is the root cause of this issue. All the lame arguments and cope that you read here is basically the fiat cartel propaganda being repeated by parrots. Blame everything except the increase of money supply. It's only a small period of time where there weren't 2 incomes in households. There may have been a male breadwinner as the main income, but the wife almost always had some sort of income as well. Only richer families lived with sole breadwinners throughout history. Because personal finance isn't taught and many folks aren't willing to sacrifice their standard of living enough to prioritize having someone at home. Prediction downvotes coming for a person who actually has their spouse at home and may know a thing or two about it. My mom started working a job as well was dad by the later 70s, before I was a teen. Out of necessity. By 1980 or earlier it was becoming common. And Reagan's massive tax cuts for the wealthy and trickle-down economics only accelerated that, if anything. It starts with the Fed and ends with the Fed. The Federal Reserve has consistently lowered interest rates, causing housing to go up in price while simultaneously printing trillions of dollars. This is basically like pouring gasoline on a house fire. The answer is wage stagnation. Before 1970, if the productivity of companies increased by X%, wages increased by X%. After 1970, productivity has continued to increase X%, but wages are not matching X% anymore. Early 90s required 2 middle-class incomes and 7 years of saving for a down payment to buy an old small starter home in the least desirable suburb of Toronto. Even when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, half of the homes had 2 incomes. Double the workforce, double the cost of living. The economy simply adjusted itself to 2 workers per household. As families got more disposable income, prices increased to the new increased demand. I saw read elsewhere on Reddit that Reagan dismantled the unions that ensured wages were high enough that a family could live comfortably off 1 income. Real income has dropped ever since. US was living island post-World War II neocolonialism. That's starting to normalize, with people all around the globe rising out of poverty while lower and middle class US takes it on the chin. More people earning money, more money to spend, prices go up. Furthermore, nobody thinks it is strange for dual incomes anymore, so it is now expected, and single income is a luxury. Women got bored. Once upon a time, a stay-at-home wife washed all the clothing, linens, and dishes by hand, while cooking every meal from scratch, over a fire. For a family of 10, we need 2 full-time breadwinners with 2 jobs to keep up with the prices. Are you asking when we have time off? Well, we don't, except when we are sleeping. And rinse and repeat.